Hi, my name is Holly Andrew. I'm the curator of the museums at Union Station. Thank you all for joining us this evening for Tracing the Legacy of Housing Discrimination in Ogden, which is the first of our Museum Live series focusing on how we can build a more equitable city. Tonight, we will be hearing from Jennifer Gnagey, an economics professor from Weber State University. She will be talking to us about what redlining and racially restrictive covenants are, how they shape our neighborhood demographics in the context of Ogden, and explore their legacy and discuss the development of her local research on these topics. Thank you.
I know we got a little bit of a slow start, so I will try to be speedy so we have plenty of time for questions that you're going to ask me in the middle of the presentation anyways. So I do want to emphasize before we get started that this is a very preliminary stage in this work. So there's a lot of questions that we don't have answers to yet and that we're still trying to find out. But I'm going to try to share some of the things that we have learned this far and sort of our plan going forward and how you can stay involved in this research that we're doing on housing discrimination in Ogden. So I'm going to start off by showing 3 snapshots of racial housing patterns in Ogden throughout different periods of history. Snapshot number 1 is from the Utah State Archives from 1921. It shows Ogden's Black neighborhood designated as the 12-block area from Wall to Grant Avenue, from 24th Street to the north to 30th Street on the south side. Jump ahead about 35 or 40 years to 1968. Snapshot 2 is an excerpt from a Weber State Signpost article that was published in January of 1968. James Gillespie, who was the president of the Ogden branch of the NAACP for 33 years, was invited to Weber State to talk about racial discrimination in Ogden. And the Signpost article that reported on his presentation quoted him as describing Washington Boulevard as the Berlin Wall that separates the Negro shacks in the west side suburbia from the better developed white section of town on the east side of Washington. To put this into a little bit of historical context, a little over 3 months later, Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And 1 week after his assassination, the US Congress passed the Fair Housing Act on April 11th. So this is a pretty critical time in the history of US housing discrimination. Okay. It's not the same. The people who are here in person are not seeing the same thing that has been being broadcast on Zoom. So I'm going to try this one more time. What if I just share the PowerPoint? That's working, right? Okay. Yes. Yes? Okay. All right, thank you for bearing with me. So this was snapshot number 1. If you missed snapshot number 2, this is snapshot number 2. All right. Snapshot number 3, jump ahead to the present day, or at least the most recent census data available, Census Bureau data available from the American Community Survey. This is a present day map of the racial demographic patterns in Ogden. It shows the percent of residents in each area that are white and non-Hispanic. The numbers are difficult to read up here, but red indicates areas with a low concentration of white non-Hispanic residents, green indicates a high concentration, and yellow is in the middle. The map clearly shows that white non-Hispanic residents tend to be more concentrated along Ogden's eastern edge, particularly east of Harrison Boulevard. And full disclosure, I happen to live in those neighborhoods east of Harrison Boulevard, about half a mile north of Weber State University. And while Mr. Gillespie, back in 1968, talked about Washington Boulevard rather than Harrison Boulevard. His general description of having a white non-Hispanic population concentrated on the east side of the city, and residents of color concentrated in the more western side of the city, still holds true today. So these three snapshots demonstrate that some of these racial demographic patterns have persisted pretty long throughout history. But they're just descriptive, right? The maps are just descriptive. They don't say anything about why or how these patterns were established or perpetuated. And when you start asking those questions, it gets really, really complicated because there's many, many, many factors that contribute to the establishment and perpetuation of these patterns. But for the purposes of presentation this evening, I'm going to focus on two tools of neighborhood segregation, particularly redlining and racially restrictive covenants that certainly contribute to establishing and perpetuating these patterns. They certainly didn't work alone, but I think they're important enough to take some time to talk about this evening. So let's get everybody on the same page with what these tools are. Redlining refers to the practice of denying a creditworthy applicant a loan for housing due to the demographics of the neighborhood in which the house is located, rather than the individual qualifications and merits of the borrower. All right, so in practice, the neighborhood demographics that were sufficient to deny someone credit tended to be the presence of communities of color. So this made it nearly impossible for people of color to obtain mortgage loans in the neighborhoods in which they lived. The second tool, racially restrictive covenants, is a deed restriction on a property that prohibits the sale or rental of the property to persons of color. To be clear, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made both of these tools illegal, but because people tend to live in the homes that they buy quite a long time after they buy them, and because home equity is the primary way that the American middle class builds wealth, these discriminatory practices have repercussions long after they were deemed illegal. And just to try to make this as concrete as possible, I want to look at two simplified hypothetical examples of how these policies can have long-lasting effects. So to make things easy to keep track of, we're going to talk about Whitney, who happens to be white, and Blake, who happens to be black. And first we can take the example of Whitney. Suppose Whitney's grandparents, shortly after World War II, buy a house in the neighborhoods around Polk Avenue. Thanks to the color of their skin, they find a seller who's willing to sell them a house in that neighborhood and a bank that's willing to give them a mortgage loan. They live there a long time, they pay off their mortgage loan. When they pass away, maybe a handful of years ago, Whitney will likely inherit a portion of the wealth her grandparents built in the home, and she can combine this with her own savings toward the down payment on a home. And since she gets to combine her own savings plus some help for her grandparents, she's more likely to be able to purchase in the area around Polk, which is the more expensive area in Ogden. On the other hand, if Blake and his family are black, if his grandparents tried to buy a home in some of the white neighborhoods, these sellers likely would not sell to his grandparents either because of personal prejudice or because of racially restrictive covenants in the neighborhood that prevented them from selling to an African-American family. In the non-white neighborhoods, Blake's grandparents couldn't find a bank willing to give them a mortgage loan because of redlining. So they likely ended up renting, let's say in the area around Lincoln Avenue. 2 generations later, it's likely that Blake is still renting. Maybe he's saving up for a down payment on a home, but since his grandparents were denied the opportunity to build wealth through home equity, he won't receive an inheritance from them. So he's less likely to be able to have a down payment for a home because he doesn't get help from his grandparents. And even if he does save enough, it's likely that he will be able to pay less toward a down payment than Whitney, who did get help from her grandparents. And he's more likely to be able to afford in some of the less expensive areas of town rather than in the more expensive areas on the eastern side. So these racial residential demographic patterns that were established with redlining and covenants are more likely to continue today because of these wealth building dynamics. And that is why housing discrimination and policies like redlining and racially restrictive covenants are primary examples of systemic racism, and the way that nothing about these examples rested on Whitney being personally racist or having feelings of contempt toward people of color, yet because of racist policies that were in place in the 30s and 40s, she benefits today from those policies while Blake is disadvantaged. Right, so that's sort of the heart of the issue, and it also suggests that redlining and racially restrictive covenants were sort of key ingredients to establishing systemic racism in housing. So I want to take a closer look at both redlining and the use of racially restrictive covenants, their origins, and how they worked in our community of Ogden and Weber County. So take a look first at redlining. And in order to better understand redlining, we need to go back to the Great Depression, the New Deal, and specifically the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1933. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation was originally created to help existing homeowners avoid foreclosure during the Great Depression. So HOLC initially helped existing homeowners refinance their mortgages with government loans to avoid foreclosure and avoid losing their homes in the Depression. And this is what it did for the first 2 years of its existence. After the first 2 years, its own lending diminished, and it expanded its work into a couple of different areas, one of which was the city survey program that eventually produced the color-coded residential security maps, later known as the redlining maps, for 239 cities in the US, including Ogden. They did this for every city that had a population of over 40,000. Yes? Question? Let it in. Okay, how do I do that? That was not it.
I think it's in the oh, it made right there.
Okay, cool. My kids. All right. So HOLC, rescuing existing homeowners from foreclosure. Oh, city survey program, every city in the US with a population over 40,000, which included Ogden. So across all 239 cities, they used common color codes, green, blue, yellow, and red, to designate different areas of lending risk. And I'll just give you an example of how they describe the extremes on that scale. Green, A, or best. They are the new, well-planned sections of the city and almost synonymous with areas where good mortgage lenders with available funds are willing to make their maximum loans. At the other end of the spectrum, red, D, are hazardous. They are characterized by detrimental influences in a pronounced degree, undesirable population or infiltration of it. Some mortgage lenders may refuse to make loans in these neighborhoods, and others will lend only on a conservative basis. Right? So these were the common descriptions or the common criteria that were used for these designations across all 239 maps. So the next thing I want to do is take a look at the Polk redlining map that was made for Ogden. It's up here. I don't know about you guys online. The visibility here is not great. I have bolded Washington Boulevard on the west side, Harrison Boulevard on the eastern side of town, just to give you a couple of reference points. You can see that west of Washington Boulevard was almost entirely C and D grades. Actually, the middle section of town had a pretty big variation in the terms of the grades that were assigned between Washington and Harrison. And then east of Harrison kind of had a little bit of the extremes, but certainly it's, we can say that the A designations, the best or least risky designations were concentrated in that eastern area, particularly the southeastern area east of present-day Harrison Boulevard. Again, so they had common criteria for assigning the color codes, but then as they assigned neighborhoods, they also provided descriptions to each of those neighborhoods. Obviously, there's a lot of neighborhoods designated on that map. I couldn't show you all of them, but to give you a few examples, the A1 designation, this is the exclusive residential section of Ogden. The leading and more affluent business and professional people reside in this area. D1, which actually covers most of the area that was designated as Ogden's Black neighborhood in 1921, contains most of Ogden's meager colored population, also a sprinkling of other foreign elements such as Mexicans, Basques, and Italians. So certainly some racially charged language in these descriptions, and the grades assigned as a result of these descriptions. Questions at this point? Yeah.
Are those Washington and Washington or Washington and Harrison?
Washington and Harrison.
Okay.
You think I missed?
And this was in 1921?
This is in 1935.
Oh, okay. Because in 21, I would have thought the A1 area would be more around Jefferson District now.
Yeah, so this is, sorry, I was referencing an older map, but this, and I should have put that in context. We talked about Polk being established in 1933 and doing the city survey program in 1935, but this is about 1935. So sorry, that was confusing. Any other questions? All right. So now we have an idea of the whole redlining maps and what it looked like for Ogden. I want to talk a little bit about what was the purpose of these maps. How were they actually used? And this is in fact a subject of some debate among scholars, and I am just getting my feet wet in this area, and I certainly don't claim to be able to definitively resolve some of these debates, but I can tell you what some of the general consensuses are. As I mentioned at the beginning, the redlining maps were developed after Polk had issued most of its own loans, had phased out most of its own lending. So it does not appear that Polk made these maps to use as a basis for its own decisions about where and when to lend. It's also, we can't, from looking at the maps, we can't really say if these maps established and created these racial demographic residential patterns, or whether they simply reflected the racial demographic patterns that already existed in the city. I think probably what would be better to say is that they reinforced and solidified the patterns that were already existing in the city. Just like Polk doesn't appear to really have used these maps for their own lending decisions, it's also a little bit unclear the extent to which these maps were shared with private mortgage lenders. And in fact, my understanding is that it varied quite a bit from city to city. I don't have a good sense of what that extent was in Ogden at this time. But even if they were widely shared with private lenders, The maps were suggestive, not prescriptive. The Holk maps did not have any force of law. Private lenders were in no way required to abide by the Holk maps in making their own decisions about who to make mortgage loans to, right? However, in order to understand the full legacy of the Holk redlining maps, we need to understand the FHA, or Federal Housing Administration, and how the Holk maps influenced the Federal Housing Administration. So I'm guessing maybe not a lot of you have heard about Holk. I'm guessing a handful of you or more have heard of the FHA. FHA was established 1 year after Holk in 1934. And whereas Holk's original mission was to help existing homeowners, the original mission of the FHA was to help expand homeownership opportunities to the American middle class. As it turns out, the American white middle class. The bottom line is there's general agreement among historians that the Holk maps influenced the FHA and the standards by which FHA decided to insure mortgages made by private lenders, right? Because that's the way that FHA works. The FHA doesn't actually issue mortgages, but they insure the mortgages of private lenders. So when you have an FHA loan, that means you get a mortgage loan from a private lender, and it's insured by the federal government through the FHA, right? And so the FHA required partnering lenders to conform to FHA guidelines, which endorsed redlining. For example, an excerpt from the 1935 FHA underwriting manual advised FHA to favor insuring mortgages where protection against some adverse influences is obtained, and important among adverse influences are infiltration of inharmonious racial groups. This effectively excluded families of color, but also anyone living in integrated neighborhoods from obtaining mortgage loans insured by the FHA. And these standards from the FHA were influenced by the information provided in the Holk redlining maps. Questions? All right, keep going. All right, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen in a different way because this is a really neat online application to show the persistence of some of these neighborhood demographic patterns indicated by the redlining map. But I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that because of some technical issues. Let's try this. Ha. All right. So this, no. All right. So I apologize, but this was the picture that was on the Facebook invitation. On this side, we've got the Holk residential security grades. On this side, we've got an inverted axis of the CDC's vulnerability index. So 0 is the lowest score, that indicates low vulnerability. 1 is the highest score, it indicates high vulnerability, and the vulnerability index includes things like median income, employment, presence of children in the family, and presence of parents in the family, and several other demographic statistics. and combines them into a vulnerability index. And what I want to show is that as you look in the A grades, of course there's exceptions, but neighborhoods that were graded A by the Hulk security maps are more likely to have low vulnerability indexes today. There's arguably not a lot of persistence in the B and C areas, but then you get down to the D areas, and again, there are certainly exceptions, but having a D grade back in the 1930s is highly correlated with having a high vulnerability index in the present day. So I would argue that this shows that there has been some persistence in these demographic patterns between 1935 and today, just like we saw with this racial demographic snapshots at the beginning of the presentation. Right. Now I'm gonna see if I can go back to the PowerPoint. Are there any questions? This is a good time for questions. Yeah.
I think it's a very good question, whether this stuff caused this segregation or just solidified it. But when you have bankers back then, you have to remember bankers in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. For those people, it was just a given that Black people and Hispanic people were a bad risk. I mean, it was just a given.
Right.
You looked at it and you said, yeah, it's a bad risk. And we have a tough time convincing them. Otherwise, even with employment and income and everything was exactly the same. That was their default socialization, dare I still believe. And so this is kind of solidifying, it's also reflecting what's already there.
Right, right.
To a great extent.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm having a really hard time getting both of these screens to show the same thing.
Another really interesting thing is how credit scores from the main credit agencies continues those same biases today. Because while they don't add race into them, they do add zip code into them. And as we can see into today, zip code is a good indicator of race. And so your credit score is partially reflected by where your grandparents were able to settle down.
I thought a really interesting example is another part of 21st century discrimination had to do with home appraisals. And many of you may have seen that report of the woman who got the right neighbor to stand in and got the appraisal. And there aren't very many situations where you have a control trial, like, same house, same neighborhood, black owner, white owner. But it's interesting because this morning on NPR there was an input by the head of the Home Appraisers Association, who is obviously quite embarrassed by this study, but also talked about even the race of the current generation of appraisers and how that influences the pricing. Because a person with a different may have their own biases, which carries economic consequences. And I was at this book club this morning, and that's where I heard this topic. Everybody, to a point, said that is not fair. But there are very many situations where you can just so clearly demonstrate same house, same and this completely different outcome based on race.
Yeah. All right, how am I doing on time? I finally got my screen back that's showing the same thing online and in person. Okay. So talked a little bit about redlining. Now I want to shift focus and talk about the second tool in the toolbox that I want to talk about today, which is racially restrictive covenants. I mentioned before, racially restrictive covenants is a deed restriction on a property that prohibits the sale or rental of the property to people of color. And on this screen, I've got an example of a racial covenant that was reported on my friend and not quite next door neighbor, but a couple blocks north, 3017 Polk Avenue from 1947. It says, no person or persons of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or lot in this subdivision, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant, right? So that's pretty explicit. It's pretty straightforward in its exclusion. Who would enforce that? That's exactly where I'm going. All right, so these were often recorded on all properties in a subdivision prior to development, usually by the land developer that bought the subdivision and then subdivided it. So in addition to the racial part, there also actually is part of a 3-page document. There's other things more technical, like how many stories your house can be and how many garages you can have, and how big the house can be on the lot. But there's also a clause at the end that says if anybody in this subdivision violates the covenant, your neighbors can sue you, all right? And up until 1948, the federal and state courts would uphold these private contracts between neighbors. And there's examples, I don't know of any specifically in Ogden, but there's certainly examples in other cities and states where home sales were rescinded and owners were evicted from their properties because the sale was deemed a violation of the covenant and not legal. So to be clear, in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that racial covenants were unenforceable by state and federal courts, but up until the Fair Housing Act of 1968, they could still be legally, privately enforced through neighborhood peer pressure, essentially, right? So now I can't sue my neighbor, but I can do the 1950s version of unfriend them, and I can convince all of my neighbors to also unfriend them and shun them socially and make them the black sheep of the neighborhood if they sell their home to someone that the neighborhood doesn't like. And this kind of neighborhood peer pressure in a very racially discriminatory fashion was fully legal until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So this is essentially the heart of the current research project that myself and more recently my research assistant Marissa, who's here and helping take notes, have been working on, is to work on identifying and making a complete collection of these racially restrictive covenants that were recorded throughout Weber County, and then create a digital map that shows where and when this complete collection of covenants were recorded, so we can have a fuller picture of the extent to which these covenants influenced neighborhood demographic patterns and fair housing choice or lack thereof in Ogden and Weber County in our history, right? So that's what we're working on. We have found 3 of them so far. This one on Polk, one in a neighborhood just a couple blocks down, and then one in South Ogden. But we expect that we will find more over the course of the summer.
What would that covenant have been put on by
the developer, at least in this case. And so oftentimes they were put on the developers before the neighborhood was actually developed. There's other examples in history where neighbors got together after the subdivision had been developed and recorded it themselves. And those tend to, again, all of the ones that I found in Ogden were recorded by the developer before the subdivision was developed, but these certainly do come in different flavors and were put in place in different ways.
Will you be looking for who these guys were, and why they did this?
And also, like I said, these covenants also contain a lot of other technical restrictions. So oftentimes you'll find covenants that have these other things like what size of house you can build and how many stories and what kind of accessory buildings, but no racial clause, right? So why did some developers choose to put racial clauses in and others didn't, even at the same in the same time period?
Well, some of what you're describing sounds like zoning laws to me. I mean, number of stories, number of families that occupy. Did the city have any covenants?
So the Supreme Court outlawed explicitly racial zoning laws in 1917. And then, lo and behold, these covenants tended to proliferate after 1917, right? And like, I mean, even in subdivisions today, sometimes they record these like CC&Rs, conditions, covenants, and restrictions. And the CC&Rs or the restrictive covenants are private agreements among the residents within a subdivision. They're not laws by the city. It's separate from zoning, but there's a lot of similarities in the kind of rules that they establish. Good question. Other questions? All right. So we've talked a little bit about redlining. We've talked a little bit about racially restrictive covenants. I've kind of outlined our research goals and the goals of our research project. So why is this important, right? This happened a long time ago. Why is now, why is it worth our time and energy to dig these up now, right? And I think we already kind of touched on that with the idea of systemic racism in the housing market and the fact that just because of the way the housing market and wealth building works, these policies that were in place many, many years ago still influence the dynamics in the housing market today. And I think it's particularly important as we discuss housing policies and education policies and health policies that we all have the same basic set of facts and understanding about what actually happened in our own community and where some of these neighborhood demographic patterns that we see and that we're grappling with today came from. And I think it's just an essential part of thoughtful policy discussion to have a good understanding of what our history looked like, right? So if you take one thing away, that's what I want you to take, that explicit government sanctioned racial housing segregation happened here in Weber County. And this wasn't just the result of people making their own decisions and wanting to live next to people of similar racial groups. It was a little bit more designed and coordinated for the explicit benefit of Caucasian residents and the explicit disadvantage of people of color, right? So that's takeaway number one. If you don't take away anything else, that's what I want you to take away. If you want to go with me a little bit further, I'll go with a little bit further. I think once we recognize that policies, not just individual behavioral decisions, were part of the problem, it becomes a little bit more clear that policies need to be part of the solution. I think a big takeaway for me is that redlining and racial covenants pretty explicitly created concentrations of both poverty and affluence, right? And I feel like there's a lot of talk in policy circles that we need to deconcentrate poverty, right? That poor educational outcomes and poor health outcomes and some other poor outcomes are associated with high concentrations of poverty, and we need to have policies that deconcentrate poverty. But I think this, we have to remember that these concentrations of poverty were created at the same time as these explicit concentrations of affluence, and I think that we need to remember that we need to address and deconcentrate affluence, and have policies targeting that deconcentration of affluence in addition to deconcentrating poverty, because I think if we do one without the other, we're just spinning our wheels, because it's two sides of the same coin, and if we don't address both sides, we're not really going to make progress on the issue. So this conclusion leads to the idea that we're going to need to reconsider our zoning codes, right? How we decide what kind of residences can be built where. Single family zoning tends to be very restrictive, economically restrictive. A single family zoning tends to create homes on relatively larger lots, right? It's just not as space efficient of a way to build housing, and as such it tends to be more expensive. So if we're thinking about deconcentrating affluence, we need to reconsider single family zoning, and if that's the kind of housing policies we have in our cities. I think some other things on the table to consider would also be school funding formulas and the way we use property taxes to fund schools. But I also feel a little bit like I'm a little bit too early in the research to have a huge, extensive discussion about policy implications. But I think one of the really, really interesting parts of this particular research, especially on racial covenants, is the idea that not just policies, right, but like organized groups of neighbors were part of the problem. And I really truly believe that they can also be part of the solution, right? So racial covenants were powerful, sure, because the court enforced them, but also because neighbors enforced them on each other, right? And I've talked about this a couple of times, and I've mentioned it in different presentations, but I always have this question of like, can we harness this power in reverse? And can we create groups of organized neighbors that take actions to be intentionally inclusive, all right? So I'm gonna riff on this idea for a little while. So Marissa and I have talked a little bit about some ways that we could get the community involved in this research, since it is in the beginning stages. It's kind of uniquely applicable to residents of our community, and I think there's potentially some benefits of having opportunities to get involved. So idea number one, I'm not sure if I think some of you are aware of this because you might have told me about it. But this past legislative session, the legislature passed HB 374, which is restrictive covenant amendments. And the first part of that legislation is that it makes a blanket statement that racial covenants across the state are invalid. So any provision in a previously recorded written instrument that expresses any preference, limitation, or discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, source of income, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity is void under this section of the Utah Code, right? But then also starting on May 15th, which happens to be last Saturday, so you can still get in early on this, it's not too late. Any homeowner can record that statement from the previous slide on their property and cannot be charged a recording fee for it. So if you feel like taking an affirmative step to say that people of all races are welcome to own or rent my property, you might want to consider doing this. And you can do this whether or not there was ever a restrictive covenant recorded on your property. And you can do this anytime the recorder's office is open. In Weber County, the recorder's office is 2380 Washington Boulevard, Suite 370, and it's open from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. Marissa and I have decided that one of us are going to make ourselves available on Tuesdays from 1 to 3 p.m. If community members want a little bit of hand holding to help look on their properties to see if there was a racially restrictive covenant recorded on their property. We can ask questions about this legislation and help folks make this statement, this inclusive statement from HB 374 recorded on your property, right? So of course you can do this on your own anytime you want, 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. But if you want to come chat with us, we can help you look for covenants on your property and answer any questions you might have. You can find us there on Tuesdays from 1 to 3 p.m. Hope to see you there. All right. And then I also thought that if anybody wants to stay involved and continue some of these discussions and talk about what other steps besides recording this statement on your property neighbors might be able to do to create more inclusive communities, I've created a Facebook group for association with this research project. It's called Neighbors for Their Fair Housing. The link is there. I'll provide updates on the research, but I also intended as a space for neighbors to learn, connect, brainstorm, and work together to address systemic racism in Weber County's housing market. Find us on Facebook. You will have to request to join. You'll have to read the little mission statement. It's basically that. And then you're welcome to get involved. I want to be clear. I don't want this to be a Facebook group for white homeowners because that's pretty much like totally missing the point. So like I want anyone who has ideas and a desire and a willingness to create more inclusive communities to feel welcome in this group, regardless of your race, regardless of whether you're a renter or a homeowner. I think we can all hold each other accountable, right? Everyone can hold each other accountable to being inclusive. It doesn't matter whether you own or rent, it doesn't matter what your race is. So I would invite you to come join us, follow the research, and I'm hoping that we can have a group meeting in person to kind of provide an update on the research, but also to discuss some of these other ideas at the end of the summer. And I guess sometimes I just assume that people know what I mean by other ideas, but like, you know, would it be possible to reach out to the Hispanic Board of Realtors and say, what's an easy way for people to translate their home listings into Spanish and get them in front of a Spanish-speaking audience? Can we do the same thing with the Ogden and AACP and say, what is the best way we can do to make sure our home listings reach an African-American audience in Weber County in Utah? Can we reach out to, you know, Utah coalition of religions? That's not it, but it's a yes. yes, and make sure that our home listings reach an audience of a broad range of faiths. So these are some of the ideas that are going through my mind, and I hope you'll join the group and join the discussion with me. If you're not on Facebook, I also created an email. It's nffhwebercounty@gmail.com. Neighbors for Their Fair Housing, nffh@webercounty@gmail.com. So if you are not on Facebook, email me there and I'll keep you in the loop. So that's what I've got. Any questions?
What other organization just welcome
Yeah.
that's still be the primary mothership facility in Salt Lake, but they're going to be hosted here in the county, and that being the association of business developers. I think that that's an organization that we want to consider meshing with in terms of people starting businesses.
Yeah, I created this group, I think, on Monday. So this is like something that I was thinking about maybe doing at the end of the research project, and then I got invited to talk about it at the beginning stage, and I was like, well, I'm just gonna go for it. We'll see. Yeah,
So, you know, my brain is always in social determinants of health.
yeah,
And I'm thinking, like, I don't fully remember the social vulnerability index, but it would be really interesting, I think. Well, I don't know, I'm just wondering if, as you guys get deeper into the research project, and you, like, is there space to look at, like, transportation mapping and look where public transportation options were? And then, of course, like, well, we have present day maps of, like, where the supermarkets are, and the convenience stores are. I'm just wondering, like, if they were overlaying the, like, redlining maps with the social vulnerability index, like, what it would look like to, like, overlay the maps with the former redline neighborhoods with, like, currently, like, low transportation, food deserts, swamps, you know, yeah. So, anyways, I don't know, like, how far you're gonna get into the project, or, like, what direction it's gonna take.
yeah. I'm not sure either. But I do know that I don't necessarily want I want to maintain an even focus, right, on the areas that were redlined, but also the areas that were green, right, the areas that did the excluding, because I feel like that's like a more active, like,
Like a place of permanence.
I don't know. I don't want to fall into that trap of like, we're going to focus all of our time and energy on the areas that were redlined that have high concentrations of poverty and people of color, because like that's not, I don't want to say that's not a problem, but like there's two problems, right? And that like that there's the problem of concentration of poverty, which is associated with food deserts and lack of transportation. But there's also the problem of like concentration of affluence and a lack of affordable housing and a lack of access, right? And I think, I don't know if that's like a good answer to your question, but I don't want the focus of this to become only on the red line areas, because we so often see that as the only problem, but the problem is on both sides of the coin, right? And that the problem is in the affluent neighborhoods and the lower income neighborhoods.
And I like that. I guess I got all now.
Yeah, no. But it just in terms of like where I want to go with this project, that would, I would pause before I went in that direction. That's all.
One of the things that, as you were talking, Jenny, one of the things that kind of struck me about that is that one of the problems with the area that has been historically affluent is it doesn't have the infrastructure. It doesn't have public transportation availability.
Right, you want to talk about transportation deserts, like
Exactly.
I can show you some.
It doesn't have a shopping that's available where folks aren't paying higher dollar prices because that's what's available in the grocery stores. You know, those kind of things, which which becomes another part of that disparity, and becomes another facet of like, so then how do we mix things? How do we create more equity? How do we get out of moving this to moving, you know?
Right, and how do we balance equity with efficiency, right? Like, in a lot of ways, it is efficient to have certain populations that need certain services in certain areas, because then you can service them all in the same area. On the other hand, then that leads to isolation and a lack of integration. So how do we balance that? And I think I'm not claiming to have the answer to that question. That's a much more difficult question. But I think it does need to be a balance, right? I think there are some benefits to integration, and it might be worth some inefficiencies in terms of transportation and locating and transporting people to services to achieve those benefits of integration. I don't think the answer is like at either extreme.
But as we continue to work on things like development, having those things in mind, as we're developing public transportation, are we developing public transportation in areas that haven't necessarily needed it in the past, but should?
Right, and it's, I mean, it's a chicken and egg problem, yeah, and it's also a political will problem.
I would add that the lack of transportation is somewhat by design to people. It's a boundary maker to keep certain people out. People who can't afford. Yeah, exactly.
You can hear it in phrases like when trying to prevent the neighborhood from losing its character.
Yeah. Are there questions from the online crew? Was there anything in the chat? All right.
I had a question. I guess maybe my heart is too dark, but I feel like so much community groups and neighborhood coming together is in order to kind of keep the neighborhood safe and watch for suspicious people and, you know, have a community watch, which are all kind of code words for keeping out undesirable, right, people of color. And so, I don't know, I kind of bristle with that. Like, how would you envision, because it seems like the infrastructure of the community is made to make boundaries around to other people out.
Yeah. I guess I think it's worth trying to see if a group can do otherwise. And like I said, I can think of some things that a group of people could do. Like I said, with the NAACP and the Hispanic Board of Realtors and the Coalition of Religious Communities, and SWAZO, that like at an individual level wouldn't be very meaningful, and like you don't sell your home that many times in your life, so unless it's like pretty straightforward, you're probably not gonna bend over backwards to like get your home ad translated in Spanish, especially if you don't know anybody who speaks Spanish, because you're like, I'm just doing like, this is just one home. There's a lot of homes. It's not worth the investment to try to get this down, because the next time I sell my home is probably going to be in like 30 or 40 years. So I'm like trying to make all these connections in the Spanish community for like this one shot. That I feel like, you know, if there was just an easy way to do it, you send your listing to this email address, they spit it back in Spanish, and they promise to post it in areas that are frequented by Spanish speakers, and you just know that, you just copy and paste your listing and send it to that email address, that like you lower that bar and people are more likely to do it. How many minutes? 1 minute. Okay. Any literally last minute questions from the online group? All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to come and listen. I hope you'll stay connected, and I'll try to keep you posted about what we find.